He despised her on their wedding night, but he never imagined jealousy would destroy him. When he realized he was losing her, the millionaire fought desperately for the love he had rejected. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like because the ending will surprise you in ways you can't imagine. The hotel room door closed with a thunderous slam that echoed like a gunshot in Charlotte's heart. The white wedding dress, which had cost more than she earned in a year as a music professor at the Manhattan Conservatory, seemed to weigh tons as she collapsed onto the empty king-size bed. The scent of orange blossoms from the decorative flowers mixed with the woody aroma of the presidential suite at the Plaza Hotel, creating a combination that should have been romantic, but in that moment only intensified the burning humiliation on her cheeks. William had left. He had simply grabbed his Armani tuxedo jacket, cast a cold glance in her direction, and muttered something about business arrangements not including unnecessary pretenses, before disappearing through the door. The wedding night she had imagined, even knowing this marriage had been arranged for family interests, transformed into a solitary experience that left her questioning every choice that had brought her here. Charlotte looked at herself in the Venetian mirror dominating the opposite wall. Her hazel eyes, normally bright with life, were reddened and empty. The professional makeup that had cost a fortune was beginning to run with the silent tears she couldn't contain. She brought trembling hands to her face, feeling the weight of the fake pearl headpiece the stylist had placed so carefully just hours before. Sometimes the real marriage doesn't begin at the altar, but in the moment we decide who we want to be after the illusions shatter, she thought, not yet knowing how much truth these words contained. Outside, in the carpeted hallways of the five-star hotel, life continued. Laughter from newlyweds in other rooms, the clinking of champagne glasses, the distant murmur of music from the reception still continuing in the ballroom on the floor below. For everyone else, it had been a perfect wedding. The 300 guests had admired the imported orchids, enjoyed the menu designed by a Michelin-starred chef, toasted to the couple's future. No one had noticed the tension in Charlotte's shoulders, nor the calculated coldness in every gesture of William's throughout the entire ceremony. Charlotte finally managed to remove the dress, struggling with the countless pearl buttons running down her back. She let it fall carelessly to the floor, that symbol of dead hopes, and put on the silk nightgown she had bought especially for this night. She felt ridiculous wearing it now, alone in that enormous bed. She slipped under the Egyptian cotton sheets and closed her eyes, wishing sleep would come quickly and erase the humiliation of this day that was supposed to be the happiest of her life. She didn't hear when William returned hours later, smelling of whiskey and the New York night. She didn't feel when he stood beside the bed, watching her sleep, with an expression mixing regret and confusion, before retreating to the sofa in the adjoining living room, where he would spend the rest of the night sleepless, questioning himself for the first time in years. The first rays of New York sunlight filtered through the ivory velvet curtains of the master bedroom of the townhouse on the Upper East Side. Charlotte woke slowly, disoriented for a moment, until the reality of her new life hit her with the force of a cold wave. She was no longer in her modest apartment near Washington Square, with walls decorated with concert posters and photographs of her students. Now she lived in this fortress of marble and wrought iron, surrounded by luxuries she had never asked for, and a silence that felt heavier than any chain. She rose from the bed, wrapped in a silk robe that had magically appeared in the closet during her absence, on the honeymoon that never was. The room was impeccable, decorated by some Manhattan designer who had clearly prioritized aesthetics over warmth. Everything was in tones of pearl gray and snow white, with touches of gold that gleamed under the morning light. Beautiful, without doubt, but cold, like the man she had married. Charlotte walked barefoot through the hallways, her feet sinking into Persian rugs that, according to William's mother during the pre-wedding visit, were worth more than an entire house in the New Jersey suburbs. The walls were adorned with artwork she recognized from her history classes, an authentic Winslow Homer here, a Georgia O'Keeffe there. She passed William's study, the door closed and silent. He had already left, of course, probably at 6 in the morning, as he did every day according to what his mother-in-law had told her with poorly disguised pride. The kitchen was the territory of Martha, the southern cook who had been working for William's family since before he was born. A robust woman of about 60 years, with dark eyes full of wisdom and rough hands from so much work. She was the only one who smiled genuinely when Charlotte entered, nervous and not quite sure what to do with herself in this townhouse that was supposed to be her home now. "Good morning, Mrs. Charlotte," said Martha, drying her hands on the embroidered apron she wore. "Shall I prepare breakfast for you? Toast with butter and jam, or would you prefer pancakes with maple syrup?" The simple act of being asked about her preferences made Charlotte's eyes fill with tears. Martha noticed immediately, and without saying a word, served her a steaming cup of coffee and indicated she should sit on the bench by the window overlooking the interior courtyard. "Mr. William is complicated," Martha finally said, choosing her words carefully while preparing scrambled eggs. "But he's not a bad man, just wounded." Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice to respond. She drank the coffee slowly, savoring the only moment of comfort she had experienced in days. Through the window she could see the courtyard someone had designed in the heart of the townhouse. Bright-colored tiles, a stone fountain with crystal water, pots overflowing with red geraniums and white jasmine. It was beautiful and completely wasted in a house where no one seemed to stop to appreciate it. During the following weeks, Charlotte established a routine that allowed her to maintain some sense of normalcy amid the emotional chaos that was her marriage. She woke early, before the house came alive with the comings and goings of gardeners, cleaning staff, and William's occasional business visitors. She ate breakfast in the kitchen with Martha, the only person in the entire townhouse who treated her like a human being and not as another decorative figure. Then she would retreat to the music room, a spacious room in the east wing of the house that, according to Martha, hadn't been used in years. It had been William's mother's favorite space, a talented pianist who had died when he was barely 10 years old. The Steinway grand piano was still there, covered with a white sheet, surrounded by shelves full of old sheet music and yellowed photographs of past recitals. Charlotte carefully removed the sheet, revealing the black, gleaming wood of the instrument. She sat on the bench, caressed the keys with reverence and played. Chopin, Debussy, Gershwin. The notes filled the empty space, bounced off the walls covered in gold damask, escaped through the windows to the garden where birds seemed to pause to listen. It was her way of reclaiming a small piece of that enormous place, of leaving her mark on a house that felt like a museum instead of a home. What Charlotte didn't know was that William, in his office in Midtown Manhattan, could hear her. There was a security recording that included audio installed by his protection company years ago, and he sometimes activated it without really knowing why. He listened to her music while reviewing contracts and budgets, and something inside his chest, something he had kept frozen for years, began to melt so slowly he didn't even notice it. The third month of marriage arrived with the New York autumn. The leaves on the trees along Fifth Avenue began to turn golden and reddish, and the air acquired that fresh, nostalgic quality that made Charlotte think of her childhood when everything seemed simpler. But in the townhouse, the seasons were barely noticeable. The climate control system kept every room at a perfect, constant temperature, and the fresh flowers the florist delivered twice a week were always the same. White roses and greenhouse orchids, regardless of what bloomed outside. Charlotte had tried to change this. One afternoon, after a visit to the flower market in Union Square, where she had bought an exuberant bouquet of red carnations, wild daisies, and fragrant jasmine, she returned home determined to give a touch of real life to that mausoleum. She replaced the perfect orchids in the entrance hall with her wildflowers, smiling as she imagined how the natural aroma would fill the space. The decorator appeared the next day, a woman from the Hamptons with a severe appearance, wearing a grey suit and a bun so tight it seemed to hurt. She looked at Charlotte's arrangement with the same horror as if she had found garbage on the floor. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, using William's surname with a tone that made it clear Charlotte had no right to it, "these arrangements don't harmonize with the house's aesthetic. Mr. Sterling has hired my services specifically to maintain a certain visual harmony. I would appreciate if you would consult with me before making changes." Charlotte felt something break inside her. It wasn't just about the flowers, it was about everything. This house, this marriage, this life she had accepted due to family pressure, and her father's promise that William was a good man. He just needs time. But how much time? And what remained of herself while she waited? "This is my house too," Charlotte responded, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "And those flowers stay." The decorator blinked, clearly not accustomed to being challenged. She opened her mouth to protest, But at that moment Martha appeared, as she always seemed to do at crucial moments, and something in her silent presence made the decorator reconsider. She nodded stiffly and withdrew, leaving behind an air of icy disapproval. "Well done, girl," Martha said when they were alone. "It was about time someone said something to that snob." But the victory was short-lived. That evening William appeared for dinner for the first time in weeks. Charlotte was surprised to see him enter the dining room, where she was sitting alone in front of a plate of roasted lamb that Martha had prepared with such care. He looked tired, with the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up and shadows under his dark green eyes. He sat at the other end of the long table, maintaining all the physical distance possible between them. They ate in silence for several minutes, only the clinking of silverware against porcelain breaking the oppressive stillness. Charlotte could feel her heart beating hard, part of her wanting to break this absurd silence, another part proud that it should be he who did it first. "I received a call from Patricia," William finally said, referring to the decorator. "She says you're redecorating." "I put fresh flowers in the entrance hall," Charlotte responded, keeping her voice neutral. "I didn't realize I needed permission to put flowers in my own house. This house has a specific aesthetic," he began, but Charlotte interrupted him. "This house has nothing. It's beautiful, yes, perfect even. But it's dead, William, like everything in it." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. William set down his fork, his fingers tightening around the linen napkin. For a moment, Charlotte thought he might respond, that they might finally have a real conversation about what was happening between them. But he simply stood up, muttered something about pending work, and disappeared toward his study. Charlotte was left alone again, staring at the empty space where he had been. The tears she had managed to hold back for 3 months finally fell, silent and bitter, staining the immaculate white tablecloth that probably cost more than her father's monthly salary. In his study, William leaned against the closed door, the sound of Charlotte's soft crying filtering through the walls of the townhouse. He closed his eyes tightly, fighting the urge to return, to apologize, to try to explain why it was so impossible for him to let anyone get close. But the memories of Victoria, the Southern belle with black eyes who had sworn to love him and had betrayed him with his best friend and business partner, were still too fresh, too painful. He had sworn never to be vulnerable again, and Charlotte, with her genuine kindness and eyes full of hope, represented exactly the kind of danger he had been running from. The routine continued, but something had changed after that tense dinner. Charlotte stopped waiting. No more tables set with candles just in case he decided to appear. No more dresses carefully chosen with the hope of capturing his attention. She dressed for herself, ate when she was hungry, transformed the music room into her true refuge. The piano sessions became longer, more intense. Charlotte began composing again, something she hadn't done since her student days at the conservatory, when dreams seemed attainable and the world was full of possibilities. The melodies born under her fingers were melancholic, charged with the loneliness she had learned to carry like a second skin. Martha became her confidant, without either of them explicitly declaring it. During mornings in the kitchen, while Charlotte drank her coffee and Martha prepared the day's meals, they talked about everything except the obvious. Martha told her stories of her youth in Georgia, of how she had come to New York seeking a better life, and had found work with the Sterling family. She told her about William's mother, Grace, a beautiful and talented woman who had filled the townhouse with music and laughter. "He was a different boy when she was alive," Martha said one day, peeling potatoes with expert hands. "Always smiling, following her around the house. She taught him to play the piano, you know. He was barely 6 years old when he started. He was good too, very good. But after she died—" Martha left the sentence unfinished, but Charlotte understood. William's father, a cold and distant businessman who rarely visited the townhouse, hadn't known how to console a heartbroken child. So William had learned to bury his pain, to build walls around his heart, to become the hard, unshakable version of a man his father approved of. Charlotte began to see him differently after this, not with more love. That would have been impossible given the distance between them, but perhaps with more understanding. Still, understanding someone's pain didn't mean she had to sacrifice herself on the altar of his healing. She too had wounds. She too had needs. She too deserved to be seen and valued. It was on one of these reflective afternoons, sitting at the piano playing one of her late mother-in-law's compositions, she had found among the old sheet music, when Charlotte made a decision that would change the course of her life. She couldn't continue like this. She couldn't keep existing in this limbo, being a wife only on paper, living in a house that would never feel like home. She needed something of her own, something that was completely hers. The next day, Charlotte made a call she had been postponing. Her mentor from the conservatory, Professor Martinez, a 70-year-old woman with silver hair and an unwavering passion for music education, answered on the third ring. "Charlotte, dear," the professor exclaimed with genuine pleasure. "It's been so long. How's married life?" Charlotte felt a knot in her throat, but managed to keep her voice steady. "Different from what I expected, Professor. But actually, I'm calling about something specific. Do you remember when you mentioned programs in music education for under-resourced communities? Are there still opportunities in that field?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Charlotte could imagine Professor Martinez frowning, catching everything that wasn't being said in that simple question. "Yes, actually there are several organizations looking for coordinators and program directors. One in particular, the Harmony Foundation, just opened its headquarters in Manhattan. Would you be interested in information?" "Very interested," Charlotte responded, feeling for the first time in months a spark of hope ignite in her chest. That night on her laptop in the privacy of her room, Charlotte researched the Harmony Foundation. It was a relatively new organization, founded by a tech entrepreneur from San Francisco named Daniel Morgan, who had made his fortune and decided to invest in social programs. The foundation's mission was simple but powerful: bring quality music education to children who would otherwise never have access to it. Charlotte read testimonials from children who had participated in pilot programs. She saw photos of recitals in public schools, of children from disadvantaged neighborhoods holding violins and flutes with expressions of pride and joy. Something inside her expanded, as if she could finally breathe fully after months of feeling suffocated. She said nothing to William. There was nothing to say yet, and anyway, when would she have the opportunity? Their paths barely crossed in that enormous townhouse, but Charlotte began to mentally prepare herself for what would come. If she got a position with the Harmony Foundation, it would mean independence. It would mean purpose. It would mean remembering who she was before becoming Mrs. Sterling, a title she used only on legal documents and never in her heart. The invitation arrived in a thick ivory paper envelope with gold lettering announcing Annual Benefit Gala at Carnegie Hall, a night for the arts. It was the type of event Charlotte would normally have found excuses to avoid. She knew how these galas worked. Hours of superficial conversations with New York's elite, fake smiles, jewelry that cost more than what most people earned in a year. But this time was different. This time, the beneficiary was the Harmony Foundation. When Charlotte mentioned the gala during one of the rare occasions when William appeared for breakfast, he looked up from the Wall Street Journal he read religiously every morning. "That gala," he said in a neutral tone. "Yes, we have to attend. It's important for business." Of course it was important for business. Everything was for William. Charlotte nodded without showing emotion, but inside her heart beat faster. She would finally meet Daniel Morgan, the man behind the foundation that had awakened in her something she thought lost: hope. The evening of the gala, Charlotte looked at herself in her dressing room's full-length mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. The deep red velvet dress she had chosen, against the stylist's suggestion to use a more discreet color, fit her figure elegantly and sensually. It wasn't the kind of dress she would wear to please William. It was the kind of dress she wore to remind herself that she still existed, that she was still a woman with desires and dreams of her own. She let her dark brown hair fall in natural waves over her bare shoulders, refusing the elaborate updo that had been suggested. A touch of red lipstick, a pair of diamond earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, one of the few pieces of jewelry she truly valued, and she was ready. William waited for her in the entrance hall, impeccable in his black tuxedo. For a moment, when she descended the stairs, something crossed his face. Surprise, perhaps, or admiration, but it disappeared so quickly that Charlotte thought she might have imagined it. Carnegie Hall was transformed into a fairy tale palace. Brilliant lights, exotic flowers, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the murmur of hundreds of conversations filled the air. Charlotte and William entered together, her hand resting lightly on his arm. the perfect image of a successful couple. No one could have guessed they were practically strangers. The evening unfolded as Charlotte had anticipated. Empty conversations with businessmen's wives who talked about vacations in the Caribbean and which designer to use for next season. William left her in the hands of these women while he disappeared to network with other businessmen, discussing mergers and acquisitions between sips of 30-year-old scotch. It was during one of these moments, when Charlotte was considering escaping to the restroom simply to have a few minutes of peace, that she saw him. Daniel Morgan was standing near the stage, talking animatedly with a group of people. He was different from what she had expected. Younger, perhaps 40 years old, with light brown hair beginning to show grey at the temples. His smile was warm and genuine, very different from the calculated smile she had seen all evening. As if sensing her gaze, Daniel looked up and his eyes met hers. He smiled and, to Charlotte's surprise, excused himself from his group and walked directly toward her. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, extending his hand. "Daniel Morgan, a pleasure to finally meet you. Your husband has been a generous donor to the foundation, though I suspect you may have more personal interest in our work than he does." Charlotte blinked, surprised by his frankness. "How do you know?" "Professor Martinez spoke very highly of you," Daniel responded with a smile. "She mentioned that her favorite former student might be interested in our work. Was she wrong?" During the next half hour, Charlotte and Daniel immersed themselves in a conversation about music, education, and the transformative power of art. He told her how the idea for the foundation was born after a visit to a school in a disadvantaged neighborhood of Oakland, where he saw children with so much talent but no access to instruments or teachers. She shared her frustration with the current education system that treated the arts as a luxury instead of a necessity. "We need people like you," Daniel finally said. "People who understand that music isn't just entertainment. It's healing. It's community. It's hope." Charlotte felt something expand in her chest, as if someone had opened a window in a room that had been closed too long. For the first time in months she felt seen, understood, valued for who she really was and not for the surname she now carried. She didn't notice William observing them from across the room, his whiskey glass frozen halfway to his lips, an expression on his face that anyone who knew him well could have identified as jealousy. 3 weeks after the gala, Charlotte received an email that made her heart almost stop. It was from the Harmony Foundation, specifically from Daniel, offering her a position as director of the new music education program in Manhattan. The salary was modest compared to William's fortune, but it meant independence. It meant purpose. It meant a reason to wake up in the morning that wasn't simply existing in a golden townhouse. Charlotte read the email 3 times, making sure she wasn't dreaming. The office would be located in a restored historic building near Lincoln Center, a space filled with natural light where her team could develop curricula, organize recitals, and most importantly, work directly with schools and communities that needed these services. "You would have complete autonomy to make decisions about the program," Daniel wrote. "I believe your experience as a teacher and your genuine passion for making music accessible to all would be invaluable to us. Would you be interested in meeting to discuss the details?" Charlotte closed her laptop, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to scream with joy, call her family, Professor Martinez, share this incredible news. But another part, more cautious, knew there was a significant obstacle to consider: William. Technically, she didn't need his permission. She was an adult woman, perfectly capable of making her own decisions about her career. But the reality was more complicated than that. They were married, lived together, even if they barely saw each other. And this decision would inevitably affect the already fragile dynamic between them. Should she tell him? What if he opposed it? Would he even care enough to have an opinion? During the following days, Charlotte debated internally. She rehearsed the conversation in her mind dozens of times, but each scenario ended with William reacting with indifference or disapproval, and neither of these options helped her make a decision. Finally, it was Martha who gave her the push she needed. One morning, while Charlotte drank her coffee with a lost look, clearly worried about something, the cook sat across from her with a sigh. "What has you so troubled, girl?" Charlotte hesitated, but something in Martha's maternal gaze made her speak. She told her about the job offer, about her fear of William's reaction, about how she felt trapped between loyalty to a marriage that barely existed and loyalty to herself. Martha listened in silence, her rough hands wrapped around her own cup of tea. When Charlotte finished, the cook gave her a long, evaluative look. "My mother used to say something," Martha began. "She said a woman who waits for permission to live her life never really lives. She only exists. Is that what you want, Charlotte? To exist?" The words resonated in Charlotte's heart like church bells. No, she didn't want to just exist. She wanted to live. She wanted to wake up with purpose, return home exhausted but satisfied, make a real difference in the world. And if William couldn't or wouldn't support that, well, maybe that was his problem, not hers. That evening, Charlotte responded to Daniel's email. "Yes," she wrote simply. "I would love to discuss the details. When would you be available to meet?" 2 days later, they met at a charming cafe near Central Park. Daniel showed her plans for the office space, explained the structure of the program, presented budgets and goals for the first year. Charlotte felt her heart expand with every word, with every possibility. This was real. This was happening. "There's just one more thing," Daniel said, as they drank lattes at the end of their meeting. "The job would start in a month. Is that enough time to organize your affairs?" Charlotte nodded, with more confidence than she actually felt. 1 month. She would have to tell William. There was no way around it. But this time it wouldn't be a question, it would be a declaration. She had made her decision. The confrontation Charlotte had been dreading came a week later, in a way she hadn't anticipated. William came home early on a Thursday afternoon, something practically unprecedented, and found her in the music room. Not playing the piano as she usually did, but talking on the phone with Daniel about the details of her new position. Charlotte didn't hear him enter. She was too absorbed in the conversation, laughing at something Daniel had said about one of his students, her voice full of an animation she rarely showed in that house. William stood in the doorway watching her, and something dark and primitive twisted in his stomach, seeing the joy on her face, knowing he wasn't the cause of it. When Charlotte finally noticed his presence, she almost dropped the phone. She quickly said goodbye to Daniel and hung up, her heart pounding hard. "William," she said, hating how her voice sounded guilty when she had nothing to feel guilty about. "You're home early." "Who was that?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Daniel Morgan from the Harmony Foundation. We were discussing—" "I know who Daniel Morgan is," William interrupted, entering the room fully. His dark green eyes were fixed on her with an intensity Charlotte had never seen before. "What I don't know is why you're having intimate phone conversations with him." "It wasn't intimate," Charlotte protested, feeling anger begin to bubble inside her. "It was professional. He offered me a job and I accepted." The silence that followed was absolute. William stared at her as if she had grown a second head. Then, slowly, he said, "You accepted a job without consulting me." "Consult you?" Charlotte stood up, all the frustration of 6 months finally finding an outlet. "Why the hell would I consult you about my career? Do you consult me about your business decisions? About your life? I barely know you exist. You pass through here like a ghost, William. You sleep in your study half the nights, disappear before dawn, return after I've gone to bed. I'm not your wife, I'm just another piece of furniture in this townhouse." "That's not fair," William responded, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "Not fair? You know what's not fair, this marriage. I agreed to marry you because my father was desperate to save his business, because your family needed you to settle down to please the board of directors, because we were supposed to mutually benefit from this arrangement. But you know what? I've been withering here, William, dying slowly in this beautiful prison you've built, and finally, I found something that makes me feel alive again. And I'll be damned if I let you or anyone else take it away from me." William looked stunned by her outburst. For a moment, Charlotte thought he would simply turn and leave, as he always did when things got too emotional. But instead, he took a step toward her, and she could see something wild and vulnerable in his gaze. "I don't trust him," William said, his voice rough. "I saw how he looked at you at the gala. I saw how you looked at him. And he's not naive, Charlotte. He knows exactly what he's doing." "And what exactly is he doing?" Charlotte challenged. "Valuing me, treating me like my opinion matters, seeing me as something more than a decorative object or an obligation. My God, William, if that threatens you, the problem isn't Daniel. The problem is you." "He wants more than your professional talent," William insisted. "It's obvious." Charlotte laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. And even if that were true, what right do you have to worry about it? We've been married for 6 months and you haven't even touched me. You don't even look at me. And now because there's someone who does, suddenly you care? The question hung between them, charged and dangerous. William stared at her with an expression that was half anger, half something deeper and more frightening. "Yes," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I care." Charlotte felt her heart stop. For all these months she had wanted some sign that she mattered to him, that her presence meant something. But now that he was finally admitting it, it felt strangely empty. Because the truth was, she no longer needed his validation. She had found her own. "You can't do this," Charlotte said, shaking her head. "You can't ignore me for half a year and then show up with jealousy when I finally find something that matters to me. It doesn't work that way, William. I deserve more than that. I deserve someone who chooses to be with me, not someone who only reacts when there's a possibility of losing me." "Then don't take the job," he responded, and there was almost a plea in his voice. "Stay here. Give me time to—" "To what?" Charlotte interrupted. "To keep ignoring me? To keep pretending this marriage is something more than a business contract? No, William. I'm not going to sacrifice my future for the possibility that maybe someday you'll decide to actually see me. I've been waiting, I've been patient, but it's over. I'm taking this job, I'm rebuilding my life. And if that's a problem for you, well, there are always divorce lawyers." The word divorce fell between them like a bomb. William paled, opening his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Charlotte turned and left the music room, leaving him alone surrounded by the echoes of all the conversations they had never had, all the opportunities he had wasted. In her room, Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed, trembling with adrenaline and emotion. She had said everything she had been holding inside for months, and although part of her felt terrible about the look on William's face, another part felt inexplicably liberated. She had drawn a line, she had finally chosen herself. Charlotte's first day of work at the Harmony Foundation coincided with the beginning of spring in Manhattan. The trees along Broadway were blooming, filling the air with the scent of new flowers and fresh possibilities. Charlotte walked toward the restored building that would house her office, carrying a leather briefcase that had belonged to her father, and feeling a mixture of nervousness and euphoria that she hadn't experienced since her first days as a professor at the conservatory. The office was everything Daniel had promised and more. The tall windows let in natural light that made everything glow. The walls were painted in warm tones of terracotta and cream, and there was an open space where her team could collaborate. There were already several employees waiting for her. Sarah, a pragmatic 30-year-old New Yorker who would be her assistant. James, a jazz musician from New Orleans who would lead the wind instrument workshops. And Emma, a young violin teacher from Boston with bright eyes full of idealism. Daniel introduced them personally, his pride in the team he had assembled evident in every word. Then, he showed Charlotte her private office, a corner room with a view of Manhattan's rooftops and the distant skyline. It was small compared to the rooms in William's townhouse, but it was completely hers, and that made it infinitely more precious. During the first weeks, Charlotte immersed herself in work with an intensity that surprised even herself. She woke at 6 in the morning, dressed in professional clothes that made her feel powerful, tailored suits in bold colors, silk blouses that flowed when she moved, the red lipstick that had become her signature, and left the townhouse before William came down for breakfast. She returned after 8 at night, exhausted but satisfied in a way she had never experienced, simply existing in that golden house. The program began to take shape under her direction. Charlotte established partnerships with 10 public schools in different neighborhoods of Manhattan and Brooklyn, each with student populations that lacked access to music education. She organized teacher training, developed curricula adapted to different age groups, oversaw the purchase of instruments, and negotiated with suppliers to get the best prices without sacrificing quality. But more than administrative tasks, what really energized her was direct contact with the children. Once a week, Charlotte personally visited one of the partner schools, taught a class, got to know the students, and remembered why she had chosen this path in the first place. Seeing an 8-year-old's face light up when producing their first clean note on a flute, or hearing a shy teenager find her voice through singing, was better than any luxury the sterling townhouse could offer. Daniel was frequently in the office, and their working relationship flourished into genuine friendship. He consulted her on important foundation decisions, valued her opinion, celebrated her successes. They regularly had lunch together, discussing not just work, but also books, movies, politics, philosophy. Charlotte discovered that Daniel had a dry sense of humor that made her laugh, a genuine humility despite his wealth, and a commitment to social justice that went far beyond superficial philanthropy. Sarah, her assistant, discreetly alerted her one afternoon after Daniel left her office. "Be careful," the New Yorker said, looking at the closed door. "He's a good man, the best boss I've ever worked for, but he's also a man, and the way he looks at you." Charlotte felt her face flush. "Don't be ridiculous. We're professionals." "Of course you are," Sarah responded with a knowing smile. "But you're also a beautiful, talented, and unhappily married woman. Don't be naive, Charlotte. Just be careful." Sarah's words lingered in Charlotte's mind during the following days, making her more aware of small gestures she had previously interpreted as simple camaraderie. The way Daniel found excuses to touch her arm during conversations, how his eyes lingered on her a second longer than necessary, the smiles they shared that seemed to contain deeper meanings. But Charlotte was determined not to cross that line. Her marriage to William might be a disaster, but technically she was still married, and her values didn't allow her to betray him that way, no matter how tempting it was. Besides, she needed this job, this independence, more than she needed any complicated romance. At the townhouse, William had begun arriving home earlier. Charlotte noticed, though she tried to pretend she didn't. He appeared in the living room where she reviewed project proposals after dinner, offering casual observations on budgets and funding strategies that revealed he had been paying more attention than she thought. He invented reasons to pass by her room in the mornings, though his attempts at conversation were always awkward and ended in uncomfortable silences. Martha observed everything with wise eyes and a mysterious smile, but didn't comment. She knew, as only someone who had lived long enough could know, that some lessons needed to be learned without external interference. The breaking point came 3 months after Charlotte began her work. The foundation organized a public recital at Lincoln Center, where 100 children from the partner programs would perform in front of an audience of donors, families, and city officials. It was the culminating event of Charlotte's first year of work, the opportunity to demonstrate that the programs were producing real results. Charlotte spent weeks preparing, making sure every detail was perfect. The program would include choir performances, instrumental solos, and a final piece where all the children would play together, an original composition that Charlotte had arranged specifically for this event. There were nights when she slept barely 3 hours, caught between rehearsals, logistical coordination, and the continuous administrative work that never stopped. The evening of the recital, Charlotte arrived at Lincoln Center 2 hours before the start, checking every aspect one last time. Her heart beat with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. She had invited her family, her parents and younger brother, who would come from Connecticut to support her. She hadn't said anything to William, assuming he wouldn't be interested. The children began to arrive, their eyes bright with excitement and nerves. Charlotte calmed them one by one, adjusted the boys' ties, fixed the girls' hair, reminding them of everything they had practiced. Daniel was there too, helping with last-minute details, his calming presence amid the controlled chaos. "You're going to be amazing," Daniel told her just before the event began, his hands resting briefly on her shoulders. "These kids are lucky to have you." Charlotte smiled, touched by his confidence. But before she could respond, she saw something that made her heart stop. In the last row of the auditorium, almost hidden in the shadows, was William. He wore a dark suit, his posture rigid, but his eyes were fixed on her with an intensity she could feel even across the distance. He had come. He had come. The recital was a triumph. The children performed with confidence and skill that exceeded all of Charlotte's expectations. There were small mistakes, of course, a wrong note here, a hesitant start there, but these only added authenticity to the performances. The audience was captivated, especially during the solos. A 9-year-old boy from Harlem who played a piece by Gershwin on guitar with surprising maturity. A 12-year-old girl from the Bronx, whose clear soprano voice made several people in the audience wipe their eyes. But it was the final piece that truly left everyone breathless. 100 children from 10 different schools, from diverse backgrounds, united by the universal language of music. Charlotte had arranged a composition that incorporated elements of traditional jazz with modern rhythms, creating something that was simultaneously familiar and new. As she conducted, she could see the faces of parents in the audience, many of them with tears of pride, and felt her heart might explode with satisfaction. When the last note finished and the audience burst into applause, Charlotte turned to look at the children. Their radiant faces, their wide smiles, the way they looked at each other in wonder at what they had accomplished together. This was what she had fought for. This was real. During the reception afterward, Charlotte was flooded with congratulations. Daniel hugged her in front of everyone, whispering in her ear, "I knew you were special from the moment I saw you." Her family was there, her father with tears in his eyes, her mother proud, her brother teasing her about becoming a celebrity. Donors approached, wanting to know more about the program, offering additional funding. In the midst of all this, Charlotte remained aware of William still in the last row, watching. He hadn't approached, hadn't tried to get her attention. He just watched, and she didn't know what to think about that. Finally, when the crowd began to disperse, Charlotte saw him stand to leave. Something impulsive made her excuse herself from a conversation with a potential donor and walk quickly toward the exit, catching him just as he was about to cross the auditorium doors. "William," she called, and he stopped, turning slowly. "It was extraordinary," he said simply, and there was something in his voice that made Charlotte's throat tighten. "You were extraordinary. You always have been. I was just too much of a coward to see it." She didn't know what to say. For all these months she had imagined this moment dozens of times, where William would finally acknowledge her worth, her talent. But now that it was happening, it felt strangely empty, because the truth was she no longer needed his validation. She had found her own. "Why did you come?" she finally asked. William looked down, his hands tucked in his pockets, and for a moment he seemed lost. "Because Martha told me I should, and because I needed to see what I'd been refusing to see. Who you really are when you're not trapped in my world." "And what do you see?" "I see someone who doesn't need me," he responded with brutal honesty. "Someone who's flourishing without me, and it's terrifying, and right, and makes me hate myself for all the time we wasted." Charlotte felt tears sting her eyes but held them back. It wasn't completely wasted. It taught me I can be strong, that I don't need anyone to complete me, that I deserve to be seen and valued. "You deserve all that and more," William said, "and I'm so sorry I didn't give you any of those things. But Charlotte, if there's any chance, any way I can—" "Charlotte," Daniel's voice interrupted, approaching with 2 champagne glasses. "We have to toast to." He stopped seeing William, his smile fading slightly. "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt." The tension between the 2 men was palpable. William looked at Daniel with a mixture of resentment and something darker. Daniel returned the gaze with a deliberate calm that made it clear he wasn't intimidated. "Daniel Morgan," he finally introduced himself, extending his hand. "You work with Charlotte, right?" "I'm married to Charlotte," William corrected, ignoring the extended hand. "I'm William Sterling." "Ah, yes, the absent husband," Daniel said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Charlotte talks about you. Occasionally." Charlotte felt she was witnessing a duel, with her as the prize. It was flattering and annoying in equal measure. "Enough," she said firmly. "Both of you. I'm not a property to fight over." "You're right," Daniel responded immediately, his expression softening. "I'm sorry, Charlotte. That was inappropriate. I was just excited about tonight's success and wanted to celebrate with you. But I can see you have matters to discuss. I'll see you tomorrow at the office." He withdrew gracefully, leaving Charlotte and William alone again. The silence between them felt heavier than before, loaded with everything that hadn't been said for months, and with the phantom presence of a man who clearly represented an alternative path for Charlotte. "He's in love with you," William finally said, his voice tense. "Maybe," Charlotte responded honestly. "But it's none of your business, William. Not when you spent months making it very clear this marriage was just a business arrangement. What if I want it to be more? What if I want to try to turn it into something real?" The question hung between them, full of possibilities and dangers. Charlotte looked at the man she had married, this stranger who now looked at her with eyes full of vulnerability he had never shown before. Part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to take the risk, but another part, the part that had learned painfully to protect herself, recoiled. "I don't know, William," she finally said. "Honestly, I don't know. You changed the game too late, and I've changed. I'm not the same person who accepted this marriage hoping you might come to love me. Now, I know I don't need anyone to love me to have a meaningful life. So if you want to try, really try, it can't be because you feel threatened by Daniel or because you suddenly realized what you might lose. It has to be because you genuinely want to build something with me. And frankly, I'm not sure you know how to do that." "You're right," William admitted, and the honesty in his voice was surprising. "I don't know how, but I want to learn if you give me the chance." Charlotte sighed, feeling suddenly tired. "We'll talk, but not tonight. Tonight was about something bigger than you and me. It was about those kids and their families and proving that music can change lives. I won't let our drama eclipse that." William nodded, accepting the answer, even though it clearly didn't satisfy him. He turned to leave, but stopped at the doorway. "I'm proud of you, Charlotte. Even if I don't have the right to be, even if it's too late, I wanted you to know." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the empty corridor, her heart divided between the satisfaction of her professional triumph and the confusion of her personal feelings. The weeks following the recital were a whirlwind. The success of the event had generated a wave of positive publicity for the Harmony Foundation, which translated into new donors, interest from more schools, and an invitation for Charlotte to present the program at a national conference on arts education in Chicago. Her calendar was overloaded, her energy constantly demanded, and she thrived in the chaos of it all. But at home, the tension was palpable. William had begun what could only be described as a campaign to win her back, though he didn't say it explicitly. He appeared for dinner more frequently, initiated conversations about her day, asked genuine questions about the program. One evening, Charlotte came down to the kitchen for a glass of water and found him there, reading at the table instead of in his study, as if casually waiting to run into her. "Can't sleep?" he asked, closing the book he was reading. "Too much to think about," Charlotte responded, filling her glass from the tap instead of using the pitcher of filtered water Martha always left in the refrigerator. "About work?" "Among other things." There was an awkward pause. William fidgeted with the book's pages, clearly wanting to say something but not knowing how. Charlotte waited, something in her curious about what would come next. "I've started seeing someone," he finally said, and for a second Charlotte's heart sank before he added, "A therapist, Dr. Reynolds, in his office near Central Park." Charlotte looked at him surprised. William, the man who prided himself on his self-control and mental strength, was going to therapy. "Why?" she asked, not with accusation but with genuine curiosity. "Because you were right," he responded, looking at her directly. "About everything. About how I've been living, about the walls I built, about being stuck in the past. And if there's any chance this marriage can become something real, I need to do the work. Not just grand gestures or pretty words, real work." Charlotte felt something soften in her chest, but she resisted the urge. "That's good, William. Really. But you can't do this for me. It has to be for you." "It is," he insisted. "Or at least it started to be. But I won't lie and pretend you're not part of the motivation. Seeing what you created, what you achieved when I stopped getting in your way, made me realize how long I've been sabotaging myself and everyone around me." It was the most honest conversation they had ever had, and Charlotte didn't know what to do with it. Part of her wanted to believe him, wanted to see this effort as genuine, but another part, the part that had been hurt and neglected for so many months, remained skeptical. "I'm glad you're seeking help," she finally said. "But William, even if you do all this work, even if you change completely, there's no guarantee we'll work out. Maybe it's too late. Maybe the damage is already done." The pain in his eyes was evident, but he nodded. "I understand. Just don't give up on us yet. Please." Charlotte didn't promise anything. She simply took her water and returned to her room, leaving him alone in the kitchen with his thoughts and his fears. Meanwhile, at the office, the relationship with Daniel had become more complicated. After the recital and the tense interaction with William, something had changed. Daniel was more cautious, maintaining more professional distance than he had before. But Charlotte could feel the tension beneath the surface, the unspoken attraction growing stronger with each day they spent working together. It culminated during a late evening at the office, 2 weeks before the Chicago conference. They were alone reviewing the presentation Charlotte would give when Daniel casually mentioned that he would also be in Chicago that weekend. "We could fly together," he suggested, "and maybe have dinner after your presentation, celebrate properly." Charlotte knew immediately what he was offering. It wasn't just a shared flight or a business dinner. It was a crossing of the line, an invitation to something more. "Daniel," she began, but he interrupted her. "I know you're married," he said, "and I respect that. But Charlotte, I also know you're not happy. I've seen how you light up when you talk about your work, about these kids, about everything you want to achieve. And then I've seen you when your phone rings and it's your husband, how something turns off in your eyes. You don't deserve that. You deserve someone who sees you, values you, chooses you every day." "And that person is you?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It could be," Daniel responded, "if you'd let me." Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling the pull of temptation. It would be so easy. Daniel was attractive, successful, clearly interested in her. They shared values, passions, vision. He made her laugh, supported her career, saw her as an equal. Everything William hadn't been. But she also knew that running to Daniel would be the easy way out. It would be giving up on her marriage without really giving it a chance to change. And although Charlotte wasn't sure William deserved that chance, she knew she needed it. She needed to know she had tried everything before giving up. "I can't," she finally said, opening her eyes. "Not like this. Not while I'm still married, no matter how complicated that marriage is. I'm not that person." Daniel nodded slowly, though disappointment was evident on his face. "I know. It's one of the reasons you're so special. But Charlotte, you can't wait forever. If you decide to stay in that marriage, if you decide to give it a chance, do it. But if it's just fear of the unknown holding you back from moving forward, then you're wasting your life." He was right, and they both knew it. That night, Charlotte returned to the townhouse feeling torn inside. She found William awake in the living room, looking at old photos of his mother. For the first time, she sat beside him uninvited, looking at the images of a beautiful woman with warm eyes and a genuine smile. "I look like her," William said suddenly. "In all the wrong ways. She died of the heart, you know. Brain aneurysm, no warning. One day she was here, the next she was gone. And I let that terrify me so much that I shut down completely. If I didn't love anyone, no one could leave me like that." "But everyone leaves anyway," Charlotte responded softly. "One way or another. That's part of the deal of being alive. The only question is whether love is worth the risk of pain." William looked at her, his dark green eyes searching hers. "Is it? I don't know," Charlotte admitted. "That's the truth, I don't know, but I think it's worth trying to find out." It was a small moment of connection, fragile as glass but real, and for now, it would have to be enough. The apartment was modest compared to the townhouse, a 2-bedroom space in Brooklyn Heights, with wrought iron balconies overlooking the Manhattan skyline and walls that needed a fresh coat of paint. But it was completely hers, and that made it infinitely more valuable than all the marble and crystal chandeliers she had left behind. Charlotte had signed the lease 2 days after her conversation with Daniel and William. The decision wasn't impulsive, despite how it might seem from the outside. It had been built on months of reflection, of realizing she couldn't rebuild her marriage while living in a space that represented everything wrong with it. She needed distance. She needed clarity. She needed to remember who she was when she wasn't defined by being William Sterling's wife. Telling William was one of the most difficult conversations of her life. She found him in his study one evening after work, surrounded by documents and looking like he hadn't slept in days. When she entered, he looked up with an expression that was half hope, half dread. "I need to talk to you," Charlotte began, and she saw him tense immediately. "Please don't say it's divorce," William said, his voice rough. "Not yet. I know I haven't been what you need, but I'm working on it, Charlotte. I'm really trying." "I know," she responded softly, "and I'm not asking for a divorce, but I need space. I rented an apartment in Brooklyn. I'm moving this weekend." The color drained from William's face. "Space? For how long?" "I don't know," Charlotte admitted. "Maybe a few months, maybe more. I need to figure out who I am outside of this, of us. And you need to figure out if you really want to be in this marriage for the right reasons, not just because there's suddenly competition or because you feel guilty." "It's not because of that," William protested, standing from his chair. "Charlotte, I know I messed everything up. I know I was a coward." that I hurt you in ways that maybe can't be repaired. But what I feel for you has nothing to do with Daniel or guilt. It's about finally waking up and realizing what I had in front of me all this time." "And what is that?" Charlotte asked. "What do you think you have in front of you?" William took a step toward her, his dark green eyes intense with emotion. "An extraordinary woman, someone who's kind without being weak, who's talented without being arrogant, who makes a real difference in the world while I just move money from one place to another. I see someone who makes me want to be better, not out of obligation, but because the contrast between your light and my darkness is too obvious to ignore." The words were beautiful, and part of Charlotte wanted to surrender to them, but she had learned painfully that words were easy. Actions, sustained change, that was hard. "Then prove it," she said. "Prove it through actions, not words. Work on yourself. Figure out who you are when you're not hiding behind walls or titles or money. And if after we've both done that work, it still makes sense to try, then we will. But not like this. Not while I'm living in your space, depending on your money, feeling like my identity is being swallowed by yours." The move was efficiently coordinated by Martha, who insisted on helping despite technically being employed by William. The cook packed Charlotte's belongings with maternal care, wrapping her sheet music in tissue paper, packing her favorite books in labeled boxes, even cutting cuttings from the garden so Charlotte could bring something living to her new space. "You're brave," Martha told her as they folded clothes, "braver than most women I've known. But girl, don't close your heart completely either. Sometimes people really do change, sometimes it's just a matter of time." "What if he doesn't change?" Charlotte asked. "What if this is all he can be?" Martha gave her a long, wise look. "Then at least you'll know, and you can move forward without regrets, but give him the chance, give him the possibility to prove himself." The Brooklyn apartment quickly became a sanctuary. Charlotte painted the walls herself in warm tones of terracotta and cream, hung light curtains that let in the morning sun, filled the space with plants and books and the vibrant energy of a neighborhood full of life. In the evenings, she could hear music from bars below, laughter from people on the streets, the constant pulse of a city that never quite slept. It was noisy and chaotic and perfect. Sarah and Emma from the office helped her decorate, bringing wine and cheese and filling the small apartment with female laughter. It was different from anything Charlotte had experienced in the townhouse. This feeling of community, of belonging, of being simply one among friends instead of a solitary figure on a pedestal. "Don't you miss the luxury?" Emma asked one evening, looking around the modest space. Charlotte considered the question honestly. "No, because this feels real, it feels mine, and that's worth more than all the marble in the world." William didn't try to contact her during the first week. Charlotte didn't know if he was deliberately giving her space, or if he simply didn't know what to say. But then things began to arrive, small signs that he was thinking of her. Her favorite coffee from a specialty roaster, delivered to the office with a simple note saying, "Thought you'd enjoy this." Dinner reservations at restaurants she had casually mentioned wanting to try, always with an open invitation but no pressure. A substantial donation check to the foundation, completely anonymous until Daniel investigated and discovered the source. But it was a different gesture that really touched her heart. One Saturday morning, Charlotte received a call from Martha asking her to come to the townhouse. When she arrived, she found the music room completely transformed. William had hired technicians to restore his mother's Steinway piano, professionally tuning it and repairing years of neglect. He had organized the sheet music that had been scattered, framed photos of his mother at recitals, converted the space into the sanctuary it should always have been. "I wanted you to have a place here," William said, standing nervously in the doorway. "Even if you decide you don't want this marriage, even if this space is all we share, I wanted you to know that your music, your presence, left an imprint on this house and on me." Charlotte touched the keys of the newly restored piano and the sound was exquisite. Tears filled her eyes, not of sadness but of something more complex, recognition of how far they had both come, mourning for the time lost and a small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, the future could be different from the past. The months that followed were a period of slow, deliberate rebuilding. Charlotte and William established a new dynamic. Weekly dinners at neutral restaurants where they could talk without the weight of the townhouse's history pressing on them. At first, these conversations were awkward, filled with long silences and superficial conversation topics, but gradually they began to deepen. William told her about his therapy, about the patterns he was discovering in himself, how Victoria's betrayal, his ex-fiancée from Charleston, had triggered deeper wounds from his childhood, the abandonment he felt when his mother died, his father's emotional coldness, the ingrained belief that love always came with an impossible price. Dr. Reynolds was helping him see how these fears had dictated all his relationships, turning him into someone who pushed people away before they could leave him. "It was easier to make you unhappy than to risk you making me unhappy," he admitted one evening, looking at his glass of red wine as if it contained all the universe's answers. "I know that sounds selfish and cruel. It was. But in my twisted mind, I was protecting myself." "And now?" Charlotte asked. "What's changed?" "Now I see that the protection I built was actually a prison," William responded, "and that the person I hurt most in the process was myself, because I lost you, or I'm losing you, and that hurts more than anything Victoria or anyone else could have done to me." Charlotte shared her own revelations, how her willingness to accept the arranged marriage had come from her own fear of disappointing her family, fear of never finding someone else, fear of being alone, how she had been so busy trying to be the perfect wife that she had forgotten to be herself. The work with the foundation had awakened her to her own power, to the realization that she didn't need someone else to feel complete. "Which makes all this scarier," she admitted, "because now, if I choose to stay, if I choose to work on this marriage, it won't be out of necessity or fear or family pressure. It'll be because I genuinely want to build a life with you, and that makes me vulnerable in a way I've never been before." "Is that a bad thing?" William asked. "I don't know," Charlotte responded honestly. "It depends on whether you're willing to be vulnerable too, whether you're willing to risk hurting me, knowing you also risk being hurt." It was during a crisis at William's company that they really tested their new dynamic. A key business partner attempted a hostile takeover, trying to seize control of a division William had built from scratch. The situation demanded all his attention. Weeks of long meetings with lawyers and the board of directors, sleepless nights analyzing contracts and strategies. The old William would have completely disappeared during this crisis, shutting down emotionally and handling everything alone. But this time was different. He called Charlotte, not to ask for business advice, but simply to talk, to vent, to admit he was scared and overwhelmed. He accepted her offer to bring him dinner to the law firm where he was camping out, and when she arrived with food from his favorite southern restaurant, his eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "You don't have to do this," he said as they ate in his office. "It's not your problem." "Maybe not," Charlotte responded, "but you're my husband, and people who care about each other support each other through hard times, even when they're figuring out if they want to keep being spouses." The crisis finally resolved, with William maintaining control but exhausted from the process. Charlotte convinced him to take a week off, something he had never done in his adult life. They went to Vermont, staying at a charming country inn with wooden beams and whitewashed walls, surrounded by vineyards and apple orchards. No laptops, no business phones, just the two of them and the Vermont countryside in all its golden late summer glory. It was there at sunset, while they walked ancient paths surrounded by wild lavender, that William told her about Victoria in complete detail. Not just the basic facts of the betrayal, but the deeper emotions. How he had been so convinced she loved him, how he had planned their future together, how discovering them together, his fiancée and his best friend, had shattered something fundamental in his ability to trust. "I blamed you for her crimes," he finally said. "I assumed everyone who said they loved me wanted something from me, and in the process, I destroyed the possibility of something real with you before it even began." Charlotte listened without interrupting, feeling the pain beneath his words. When he finished, she told him her own story of past hurt. A professor at the conservatory who had manipulated her student admiration, crossing lines that should never have been crossed and leaving her feeling used and ashamed. How that had shaped her own walls, her own wariness around men in positions of power. "I guess we both came to this marriage wounded," Charlotte said, "and instead of healing each other, we just hurt each other more." "But is there a way to heal now?" William asked. "Together." Charlotte looked toward the horizon, where the sun was setting in shades of orange and pink over the rolling hills. "I don't know, but for the first time, I think it might be worth trying to find out." The call came at 2 in the morning. Charlotte was sound asleep in her Brooklyn apartment when her phone rang, the bright, insistent tone piercing her dreams. For a disoriented moment, she fumbled for the device on her nightstand, seeing William's name flashing on the screen. Her heart immediately raced. He never called at these hours. Something was wrong. "William, what happened?" "Charlotte." His voice was rough, broken in a way that frightened her. "I need you to come, please. I just need you here." She didn't ask questions. She quickly dressed, called a cab, and arrived at the townhouse in 20 minutes. Martha let her in, her wrinkled face full of concern. She pointed toward the music room, where a dim light glowed under the closed door. Charlotte entered to find William sitting on the piano bench, still dressed in his work suit but disheveled. His tie loosened, his eyes reddened. In his hands he held an old letter, the paper yellowed with years. Around him, scattered across the piano's surface, were more letters and photographs. "I was cleaning out my father's study," he said without preamble when he saw her. "He died 10 years ago, and I could never face going through his things. But tonight, I don't know why, I felt I needed to. And I found this." He handed her the letter he was holding. It was written in his mother's elegant handwriting, addressed to his father. Charlotte read it slowly, her heart breaking with every word. It was a plea from a desperate woman, begging her husband to show some emotion, to let her in, to be a present father to their son. It described years of loneliness in that marriage, of being treated as a beautiful accessory instead of a partner, of watching her young son copy his father's emotional coldness because he thought that's how men should be. "There were dozens of these," William said, his voice breaking. "Years of letters she wrote him that he kept but never responded to, and photos. Photos of her trying to smile at family events on trips in our home. But if you look carefully, you can see the pain in her eyes, the loneliness." "William!" "I'm him," he interrupted, looking up at her with eyes full of tears. "I became my father. I did exactly what I swore I'd never do. I treated you the way he treated her. I pushed her to the margins of my life, made her feel invisible, and she died alone in that house, surrounded by luxury but emotionally abandoned. Is that what I'm doing to you too? Charlotte, am I killing you slowly with my indifference?" Charlotte sat beside him on the piano bench, taking his trembling hands in hers. "No, because I left before that could happen, and because you chose to change." "But is it enough?" William asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do you know I've really changed? How do you know I won't fall back into those patterns the moment things get difficult?" "I don't," Charlotte admitted. "No one can know that for certain. Real change doesn't come with guarantees, William. It comes with daily choice, with conscious work, with continued vulnerability even when it's scary. But here's what I do know. You've been doing that work. You've been showing up, being honest, allowing yourself to be vulnerable in ways I know are terrifying for you. And that counts. That matters." William collapsed against her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she felt him truly cry. Not silent tears or controlled expressions of emotion, but full sobs of pain and regret that shook his entire body. Charlotte held him, letting him release decades of accumulated grief, of self-imposed loneliness, a fear of becoming the man he now saw he had always been. "I don't want to lose you," he finally said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "Not like my father lost my mother. Not by choice, by cowardice, by fear. But Charlotte, I'm terrified. Terrified that even if I try with my whole soul, it still won't be enough. Terrified that the damage I did is irreparable." Charlotte lifted his face to hers, forcing him to look at her. "The damage is deep, I won't lie about that. And trust is something that's rebuilt slowly, choice by choice, day by day. But William, the reason I'm still here, the reason I haven't filed divorce papers, even though everything would have been simpler, is because I see something in you worth saving. I see the man you could be when you drop the defenses, and that man could be someone I want to spend my life with." "Could be?" William whispered. "Could be," Charlotte repeated, "if you keep doing the work, if you keep being brave, if you let me in not just when it's convenient but especially when it's difficult." William nodded, his hands gripping hers as if she were his lifeline. And maybe she was. Maybe they had both been lifelines for each other all this time, without knowing it, navigating treacherous waters towards something that could, with enough effort and grace, resemble love. They sat there on the piano bench until dawn began to filter through the windows, painting the music room in shades of pink and gold. And when they finally stood, tired but somehow lighter, Charlotte did something she hadn't done in almost a year. She played one of his mother's compositions, a beautiful, melancholic piece that filled the room with emotion. William stood behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders, listening. And in the music, in the space between the notes, they began to find a language they could both speak. The vow renewal took place 18 months after that transformative night in the music room, but this time everything was different. Instead of the elaborate spectacle of their first wedding, they chose an intimate ceremony at a small chapel in the Hamptons, surrounded only by people who truly mattered. Charlotte's immediate family, Martha, William's best friend David, Professor Martinez, Sarah and Emma from the office, and surprisingly Daniel, who had accepted the invitation with genuine grace and good wishes. The chapel was small and charming, with stone walls, centuries old and dark wooden beams. The garden outside was full of beach roses and lavender, their fragrance filling the warm June air. There were no imported orchids or designer decorations. Charlotte had arranged the flowers herself that morning, her hands working alongside her mother and Martha, laughing as they shared stories and strong coffee. Charlotte wore a simple white linen dress, no veil or elaborate ornaments, her hair loose in natural waves. William wore a sand-colored linen suit, his genuine smile completely transforming his usually severe features. When they saw each other in the garden before the ceremony, a conscious decision to break with tradition, they both felt their hearts might explode. "You're beautiful," William said, his voice full of wonder. "I'm happy," Charlotte corrected. "That's what you see." The ceremony was officiated by a local minister who had gotten to know them during their visits to the Hamptons, an older man with kind eyes who understood this wasn't a common marriage. The vows they exchanged were ones they had written together during weeks of nighttime conversations in Charlotte's apartment, words that reflected their specific truth. "Charlotte," William began, his voice trembling slightly, "I can't promise you perfection. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes or that I'll always know the right words to say, but I can promise you effort. I can promise you honesty, even when it's difficult. I can promise that every day I'll choose to see you, hear you, value you, that I'll never take you for granted again, that I'll work to be the man you deserve, not out of obligation, but because loving you makes me want to be better." "William," Charlotte responded, tears shining in her eyes, "I promise you patience, but not complacency. I promise you love, but also boundaries. I promise I'll continue being completely myself, that I'll never make myself small to make you feel big. And I promise to believe in who you're becoming while keeping the memory of who you were so we never go back there. I promise you a marriage based on choice, not convenience, on passion, not obligation, on truth, even when it hurts." There were no new rings. They wore the originals from their first wedding, but this time they had different meaning. They weren't symbols of a business deal, but markers of a freely chosen commitment, earned through pain and work and grace. The reception was at the inn where they had stayed during their healing trip months before. They ate lobster rolls prepared outdoors, drank local wine from Long Island vineyards, danced under the stars to the sound of a small band, playing both traditional jazz and modern music. Charlotte watched William truly laugh, interacting with her family in ways that showed he was finally present, finally participating, instead of simply enduring social obligations. Daniel approached Charlotte at a quiet moment, when she was alone at the edge of the garden watching the guests dance. "You're happy," he said, and it was a statement, not a question. "I am," Charlotte responded honestly. "Good." Daniel smiled, without a trace of bitterness. "Then I made the right decision not to fight for you anymore, though I have to admit it was tempting." "You're a good man, Daniel," Charlotte said. "You'll find someone who can give you their whole heart without reservations." "I already have," he responded with a mischievous smile. "Her name is Rebecca, and she's a violinist with the New York Philharmonic. We met at a fundraising event last month, but that's a story for another time." Charlotte felt a wave of relief and genuine joy for him. Some love stories weren't meant to be, but that didn't diminish their importance. Daniel had been a catalyst, a reminder that she deserved to be valued, That gift would remain with her always. Later that evening, in the inn's room with its whitewashed walls and open windows, letting in the scented summer air, Charlotte and William finally shared the wedding night they had never had. But this was different from anything that would have been possible on that first horrible night at the plaza. This was slow and tender, filled with laughter and some tears, with mutual vulnerability and genuine desire. Afterward, lying tangled in linen sheets, William traced lazy patterns on Charlotte's shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That real love isn't what the movies show us," Charlotte responded thoughtfully. "It's not fireworks and consuming passion from the first moment. At least not for everyone. Sometimes it's this. It's the love you build brick by brick after the illusions have crumbled. It's the love you choose to create from ruins, from mistakes, from difficult truths, and maybe that's more valuable precisely because it wasn't easy." "Earned love versus given love," William murmured. "You're right. And Charlotte, I want you to know something. Even if this ended tomorrow, even if we discovered we can't make it work long term, I would never regret these last months. You gave me back to myself. You showed me it was possible to change. That's a gift I'll carry with me no matter what happens." "It won't end tomorrow," Charlotte said with confidence. "This is just the beginning." And as they fell asleep in each other's arms, the night breeze bringing the scent of roses and lavender through the windows, they both knew she was right. This was just the beginning. Not the end of a fairy tale, but the beginning of something much more real, and therefore much more precious. In the years that followed, Charlotte and William built a life that reflected who they had become through their struggle. They kept the Brooklyn apartment as Charlotte's space, where she could retreat when she needed creative solitude, but spent most of their nights at the townhouse, which had been gradually transformed into a real home. The music room became the heart of the house, where Charlotte taught promising students on Saturdays, and where they hosted monthly recitals for children from the Foundation's programs. William stopped using work as an escape, establishing boundaries he had never considered before. He left the office at 6, came home for dinner, took real vacations. He became actively involved with the Harmony Foundation, not just as a donor but as a board member. His business skills channeled towards something more meaningful than simply accumulating wealth. They had their challenges, of course. The path to a healthy marriage is never perfectly smooth. There were moments when old patterns threatened to return, when William's fear of vulnerability manifested as distance, or when Charlotte's frustration bubbled over into anger. But the difference was that now they talked about it. Now they sought therapy together when necessary. Now they chose the hard work of real intimacy over the comfort of familiar defenses. 3 years after their vow renewal, Charlotte gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, after William's mother. Seeing William hold his daughter for the first time, tears streaming down his face as he whispered promises to be the father his never was, made Charlotte's heart feel so full she thought it might burst. And when she nursed their baby in the music room, while William softly played the piano, yes, he had started playing again. Rediscovering the skill he had abandoned after his mother's death, Charlotte knew that all the struggles, all the pain had been worth it, because this was love. Not the fairy tale version we're promised as children, but the real, complicated, fought-for, chosen version. The love that survives not because it's easy, but because both people decide day after day that it's worth the work. And as Charlotte looked at her husband, this man who had started as a stranger became her greatest challenge and finally transformed into her true partner. She knew their story hadn't been beautiful in the traditional sense, but it had been true, and truth, in the end, was the most beautiful form of love of all.